I
My
never knew
name is
how much
Kimberly
those letters meant
Morris. I
until
am
she was gone.
29. Last
They were
Tuesday,
all
I
I had
sat in a
left.
downtown Seattle
And
law
now,
office and watched my
I
older sister
don't.
laugh until she spilled her coffee because our grandfather left me a rotting house while she and our parents inherited millions. Enjoy the mold, Kimmy Jessica sneered. She dabbed her sleeve, careful not to ruin her silk blouse. Maybe you can fix it up with your little warehouse salary. My father did not reprimand her. He just tapped his fingers against his leather briefcase, his mind already offshore calculating his new net worth. My mother gave me a look of practiced pity. We always knew Charles was losing his mind at the end, sweetheart, she said. But do not worry, we will hire a crew to tear it down for you so you can sell the dirt. I just sat there in my 3-year-old gray cardigan, listening to my own family reduce me to a charity case. And I was not even surprised. That is the part that stung. Everyone in that room, smelling of old mahogany and expensive cologne, had already claimed their pieces of the board. My father Richard got $4 million in liquid assets. My mother Diane received the sprawling Bellevue estate. Jessica and her husband Brad inherited the operating rights to Grandpa Charles's most lucrative freight subsidiaries, a package valued near $6 million. And me, the dependable one. The granddaughter who spent every other weekend organizing Charles's medical files while the rest of them texted him heart emojis from their country club. I got the deed to a notorious dilapidated 1920s craftsman house in Bellingham, a local eyesore with a sagging porch and peeling paint. But they did not know about the sealed envelope tucked inside the folder. Inside was not a check or an apology. It was a single piece of yellowed paper with a 10-digit phone number penned in Grandpa's sharp, sloping handwriting. Before I tell you what happens when the family punchline actually dials that number, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe, but only if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are listening from. Now let me take you back to the moment the attorney flipped to the last page of the will. Grandpa Charles built a logistics empire across Washington state from nothing. He was a man who respected sweat and grit, yet his beneficiaries were people who had never lifted a box in their lives. I work 50 hours a week as a supply chain coordinator for a mid-sized freight company. I drive a reliable Subaru. My family treats my career like a temporary phase. So when the lawyer, a silver-haired man whose suit cost more than my car, announced my inheritance, the room hummed with their quiet triumph. They got the cash, the mansions, and the operating companies. I got the blight. They looked at me like a loser holding a losing ticket. They had already written me off. But what my mother, my father, and my sister did not realize was that Grandpa Charles never did anything without a reason. And the rotting house they were all laughing at was not a punishment. It was a trap. All I had to do was pick up the phone. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room clicked shut behind us, sealing the estate attorney inside with his ledgers and his silence. We stepped out into the 12th floor lobby of the law firm. The space was a cavern of floor-to-ceiling glass and polished marble, overlooking the gray, churning waters of Puget Sound. Jessica was still vibrating with that sharp, practiced amusement she used whenever she felt superior. She adjusted her designer scarf, the expensive silk catching the pale afternoon light, and checked her reflection in the glass. My sister had spent her entire life perfecting the art of the subtle insult. Growing up, if I scored high on an exam, she would loudly congratulate me on being book smart since I lacked social grace. When I took my job as a supply chain coordinator, a role that required managing dozens of freight routes and tight margins, she told her friends I worked in a warehouse moving boxes. Today was no different. Her inheritance was a crown, and mine was the punchline. Her husband Brad trailed half a step behind her. Brad was a man whose entire career consisted of attending networking events, playing golf on Tuesdays, and using corporate buzzwords to mask his incompetence. He had failed upward until he married my sister, and now he was the co-owner of 3 highly lucrative freight subsidiaries. He checked his luxury smartwatch, let out a performative sigh, and clapped a hand on my shoulder. The physical weight of his hand felt like a deliberate claim of territory. "Listen, Kim," Brad said, his voice dropping into that patronizing tone usually reserved for explaining basic arithmetic to a child. Bellingham has some tricky zoning laws. When you decide to offload that rotting heap, let me know. I have a buddy in commercial demolition who can give you a steep discount. We can write the labor off as a family business expense. Jessica snorted her heels, clicking a sharp rhythm toward the elevator bank. Do not overwhelm her, Brad. She has to figure out how to pay the municipal property taxes first. They do not accept warehouse wages. We rode the elevator down to the parking garage in a stifling quiet. My father stood near the control panel, staring at the digital numbers ticking downward. Richard Morris never looked at people when he spoke to them. He looked at whatever was next on his agenda. He adjusted his grip on his leather briefcase, the one currently holding documents that proved he was $4 million richer. You need to be realistic about this property, Kimberly, he said, his voice flat and transactional. Charles was a stubborn man. He kept that piece of blight out of pure sentimentality, but sentimentality does not pay bills or generate revenue. I can wire you $5,000 to cover the initial municipal fines, but after that, you are on your own. My father valued human beings based solely on their return on investment. In his eyes, Jessica was his blue chip stock. She went to the right parties, married the right man, and projected the right image. I was the bad investment. I chose a public university over a private one. I took a job managing real-world logistics instead of attending charity galas. My mother Diane stepped off the elevator first, pulling the collar of her tailored trench coat tight against the damp garage air. She gave me that practiced sympathetic tilt of the head she had perfected at country club luncheons. Just hire a crew to tear it down, sweetheart, she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. Sell the dirt. It is the only way you will extract any value out of that mess. They had seamlessly reduced my inheritance to a pity project and me to a helpless dependent. I did not scream, I did not cry, I just watched them walk away. I watched my parents climb into their pristine luxury sedan. I watched Jessica and Brad pull away in a sleek European sport utility vehicle. I walked across the damp concrete to my Subaru. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a familiar hum, and pulled the sealed envelope out of my pocket. The paper was stiff and yellowed with age. The 10 digits written in dark ink were precise. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel, the exhaust from my sister's departing vehicle still lingering in the air. I thought about the last 14 months. I thought about the sharp smell of hospital antiseptic and the constant hum of heart monitors. While Jessica and Brad were touring vineyards in Napa Valley, I was sitting in sterile waiting rooms reading shipping manifests on my laptop while Charles underwent chemotherapy. While my mother was ordering custom floral arrangements to show her friends how much she cared, I was holding a plastic cup of ice chips for a man who could barely swallow. Charles never thanked me with grand speeches. He just watched me work. He watched me sort his medical bills, negotiate with insurance adjusters, and keep his affairs in order. My family thought Charles was losing his mind in those final months. They thought leaving me the Bellingham property was the ultimate proof of his cognitive decline. But sitting in that cold parking garage holding a phone number that had no name attached to it, a different reality began to take shape in my mind. Charles did not make mistakes. He built a logistics empire from the ground up because he understood infrastructure, and more importantly, he understood human nature. He knew Jessica would look at a crumbling porch and see trash. He knew my father would look at a rural location and see a liability. He also knew I was the only person in the family who would look deeper. Before I tell you who answered the phone when I finally dialed those 10 digits, I need to ask you something. Hit that like and subscribe button, but only do it if you know exactly what it feels like to sit in a room full of people who share your last name and realize none of them respect you. Only do it if you have been the family punchline, the dependable background character, the one everyone assumes will just quietly accept the scraps. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one because I love knowing where you are finding your own strength. I put the car in gear and drove up the concrete ramp, merging onto the rain-slicked streets of downtown Seattle. The laughter from the conference room was still echoing in my memory. Jessica's sneer, Brad's patronizing offer for a demolition discount, My father's meager $5,000 handout. They had already spent their millions in their heads. They thought they held all the cards. They thought they had won. But as I merged onto Interstate 5, heading north toward Bellingham, the single piece of paper sitting on my passenger seat felt heavier than a stack of cash. The rain started coming down harder, beating against the windshield, but my grip on the steering wheel was steady. I was driving toward a house they deemed worthless to call a number they did not know existed. I was not the punchline anymore. And whoever was waiting on the other end of that line was about to hand me the hammer I needed to shatter their illusion. The rain started coming down in heavy, unrelenting sheets by the time I passed the Everett city limits. The rhythmic thud of the wipers across the windshield became the only sound inside the car. Interstate 5 stretched north like a dark gray ribbon, cutting through thick stands of Douglas fir that looked almost black under the bruised afternoon sky. Every time a semi-truck passed, the spray hit my Subaru, shaking the frame and reminding me exactly how small I was on this road. I spend 50 hours a week managing the movement of those trucks. I am a supply chain coordinator. My brain is wired to understand routes, fuel costs, cargo weights, and efficiency. I look at a map and see profit margins. But looking at the route to Bellingham, I only saw a dead end. My grandfather built his fortune near these northern ports. Before he owned high-rises and logistics fleets, he was a man in steel-toed boots, holding a clipboard on a rain-slicked dock. He understood the value of land near the water, yet the property he left me made no logical sense. The heater in my car struggled against the damp Washington chill, blowing lukewarm air across my hands as I gripped the steering wheel. I could not stop thinking about the contrast between my current reality and my family. Right now, Richard and Diane were likely pulling into the gated driveway of their Bellevue estate. Jessica and Brad were probably on a showroom floor pointing at luxury vehicles. They were celebrating their sudden elevation. I was driving toward a piece of blight. I took the exit for Bellingham, leaving the highway for winding two-lane roads that led away from the commercial center. The neighborhood shifted from busy storefronts to older, forgotten residential zones. The trees grew thicker here, their branches arching over the pavement like a canopy. When I finally spotted the address, my foot hit the brake pedal by instinct. The tires crunched onto a driveway made of crushed gravel and overgrown weeds. I shifted into park and left the engine running. The house looked worse than I remembered from the single faded photograph Grandpa kept in his desk. It stood alone at the end of the lot, surrounded by towering pines that cast long, suffocating shadows over the roof. The structure was a 1920s craftsman, but any charm it once held had been erased by decades of harsh coastal weather. The paint, which might have been white once, was peeling off the siding like a bad sunburn. The front porch sagged under the weight of rot and neglect. The gutters were choked with wet, decaying pine needles, causing rainwater to spill over the edges in muddy waterfalls. It looked like a monument to abandonment. It looked like the punchline my sister claimed it was. I sat in the driver's seat, listening to the rain hammer the metal roof of my car. The dampness seemed to seep through the glass, settling into my bones. For the first time all day, the adrenaline of the will reading faded, replaced by a cold, hollow knot in my stomach. What if they were right? What if Charles really had lost his grip on reality in his final days? What if keeping this crumbling wood was just the sentimental mistake of a dying man, and I was the unfortunate recipient of his final delusion? I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the yellowed paper. The 10 digits stared back at me in the dim light of the cabin. My hands were shaking. It was not from the cold. It was from the terrifying realization that this decaying structure might be the exact measure of my worth in my grandfather's eyes. I had traded my weekends, my social life, and my peace of mind to care for him, and my reward was a liability. A municipal nightmare that would drain my meager savings just to bring it up to code. I could put the car in reverse. I could drive back to Seattle, call the demolition company Brad recommended, and wipe my hands of the entire thing. I could sell the dirt, pay off my student loans, and continue living my quiet, invisible life. That would be the safe choice. That would be the choice Jessica expected me to make. But Charles did not raise me to be safe. He raised me to look at the details other people missed. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I typed the numbers slowly, verifying each digit against the sloping ink on the page. I hit the green call button and lifted the phone to my ear. The line clicked, followed by a long, empty tone. It rang once. The sound felt amplified in the quiet car. It rang twice. Then the ringing stopped. There was no automated greeting. There was no hold music, just the faint hum of an open connection. I waited, the breath caught in my throat. "I have been waiting for your call, Air." The voice was male. It was crisp, steady, and carried the specific cadence of a man who measured his words by the ounce. It was not the voice of a local contractor or a municipal tax clerk. It sounded like authority. The word air hung in the damp air inside my car. Nobody had ever called me that. To my family, I was an afterthought. To this stranger, I was a successor. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Elias Thorne," the man replied. The audio was crystal clear, cutting through the sound of the rain. "I was your grandfather's shadow attorney." I furrowed my brow, staring at the sagging front porch through the windshield wipers. Shadow attorney Charles used the downtown firm, the one with the mahogany tables. He used them for the assets he wanted. Public, Elias corrected smoothly. He used me for the infrastructure that actually mattered. And if you are sitting outside the Bellingham property right now, you are wasting time. My spine went rigid. I scanned the dark tree line and the empty street in my rearview mirror. "How do you know I am here?" "Because Charles told me that the moment the will was read, you would drive straight to the property instead of going to a bank," Elias said. "He knew your father and your sister would walk out of that room thinking they won the lottery. He also knew you would look at a piece of blight and try to figure out the logic behind it. He chose you because you coordinate logistics for a living. You know that a strong foundation is worth more than a fresh coat of paint." I stared at the rotting wood of the front steps. "I do not see a strong foundation, Mr. Thorne. I see a teardown. You are looking at the exterior, Kimberly." Elias's voice dropped an octave, growing even more serious. "Turn off your car. Walk up to the front door. The key is taped beneath the loose floorboard under the welcome mat. You need to go inside." "Why? What is in there?" A long pause stretched across the line. When Elias spoke again, the words sent a sharp thrill of adrenaline straight through my chest, chasing away every ounce of the cold. "The rest of them got the pocket change," Elias said quietly. "The real inheritance is under the floorboards." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my car for a long time. The rain was still beating against the windshield, but my hands had stopped shaking. Elias Thorne told me he would be there in an hour. I spent that time watching the shadows shift across the sagging porch of the Bellingham property. My mind raced through a dozen different scenarios, but none of them made sense of the decaying wood and the overgrown yard. I am a person who relies on logic. In supply chain logistics, every delayed shipment has a reason. Every broken route has a cause. You just have to trace the steps backward to find the break in the chain. But looking at this house, the chain seemed entirely broken. 62 minutes later, a muted gray sedan pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching over the wet gravel. The engine cut off. A man stepped out into the downpour. He did not look like the estate attorney from the downtown firm. He did not wear a tailored suit or a silk tie. Elias Thorne appeared to be in his late 60s, dressed in a charcoal trench coat that had seen better days. He carried a battered leather briefcase in one hand and a long black umbrella in the other, but he did not bother to open the umbrella. He just walked through the heavy rain with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who was entirely comfortable with the storm. I opened my car door and stepped out to meet him at the edge of the yard. The cold water instantly soaked through my cardigan, but I did not retreat. Elias stopped at the base of the wooden steps. His eyes were sharp, evaluating me with a quiet intensity that reminded me instantly of my grandfather. "Charles told me you would be the only one to actually call the number?" Elias said, his voice just as steady in person as it had been over the phone. Richard would have ignored it. Jessica would have immediately listed this property on Zillow to extract whatever petty cash she could. But you waited. I followed him up the rotting wooden steps. They groaned under our weight. I reached under the frayed welcome mat and found a loose board just like he instructed on the call. Beneath it rested an old brass key. I handed it to Elias. He slid it into the rusted deadbolt. The lock required a hard, practiced shove before the door finally yielded with a loud scrape against the floorboards. We stepped over the threshold into the dark foyer. The inside of the house smelled exactly like you would expect. Dust, stale air, and old timber. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and the floorboards creaked in protest with every step we took. It was a shell of a home, stripped of furniture and life. My sister would have taken one look at this hallway and walked out laughing. My father would have calculated the cost of pest control and filed for a demolition permit. But as I followed Elias deeper into the shadows of the house, I noticed things they would have missed. The load-bearing walls were thick and perfectly plumb. The window frames, despite the peeling paint, showed no signs of water damage inside the sill. The bones of this place were unyielding. Elias did not offer a tour. He walked with purpose down the narrow corridor and turned into what used to be the study. The room was empty except for a faded rectangular stain on the floor, where a heavy desk must have sat decades ago. Rain lashed against the single window, casting gray light across the scuffed hardwood. Elias knelt on the floor near the center of the room. He set his battered briefcase aside and ran his fingers over the wood grain. "Your grandfather built an empire," Kimberly Elias said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. But he always kept his most valuable assets out of the spotlight. He understood that wealth is a target. If you build a glass tower, everyone wants to throw a stone. If you buy an old house in a forgotten zip code, people just drive right past it. His fingers stopped over a specific dark knot in the oak flooring. He pressed down hard. A faint mechanical click sounded beneath the wood. Elias gripped the edge of the floorboard and pulled upward. It was heavy, reinforced with steel on the underside. I stepped closer, staring into the dark cavity beneath the floor. Resting in the recess was a state-of-the-art fireproof biometric safe. The digital keypad cast a faint green glow, a stark contrast to the decaying 1920s architecture surrounding us. Elias placed his thumb against the scanner. A soft chime echoed in the room, followed by the heavy thud of locking bolts retracting. "Charles knew exactly who your father and sister were." Elias continued, gripping the handle of the heavy steel door. He knew Richard and Jessica had the financial discipline of a match striking a powder keg. I thought about my sister taking out personal loans just to upgrade her kitchen to match a magazine spread while Charles was undergoing radiation therapy. I thought about my father hiding debts behind offshore accounts so his country club friends would not know his liquid cash was tied up. Elias was right. They performed wealth, but they did not protect it. He pulled the safe door open. "They care about titles," Elias said. "They care about optics. They care about the cash flow that allows them to buy yachts and luxury cars to impress people they do not even like. But they do not understand infrastructure. They do not understand the soil that allows those things to grow." Elias reached into the dark interior of the safe and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents. They were bound in sturdy legal folders, the edges crisp and pristine. He did not hand them to me right away. He just held them, letting the weight of the moment settle over the dusty room. "When Charles handed them the freight subsidiaries this morning, he knew they would celebrate," Elias said quietly. "He knew they would assume they had won the war, but Charles never handed over power without keeping a leash." "What are those?" I asked, my voice tight. Elias laid the stack of folders on the scuffed floorboards right in front of me. I knelt beside him, my wet clothes sticking to my skin, and flipped open the first cover. The pages were dense with legal jargon, notarized signatures, and state seals. "I am a supply chain coordinator. I spend my days reading contracts and routing manifests. I know what ownership looks like on paper. These are master deeds," Elias explained, "and they are all registered to a holding company I guarantee your father and sister have never heard of." I ran my finger over the bold text at the top of the page. "Cascade Blueprint, LLC." "Who owns this company?" I asked, looking up at him. Elias met my gaze, his expression unchanging. "That is the question, Kimberly. You see, your sister inherited the trucks and the operating rights. She inherited the right to run the business. But she does not own the business. He tapped the thick stack of paper. This holding company owns the land those warehouses sit on. This holding company owns the patents to the logistics software your sister uses to route her freights. This holding company owns the master leases. I stared at the documents, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. The rain continued to pound against the window, but the sound seemed to fade away, replaced by the sheer magnitude of what Elias was telling me. My sister thought she owned the empire. My father thought he had secured the legacy. But they were just tenants in a house someone else built. And the person who held the keys to that house was sitting in a damp, rotting craftsman in Bellingham. But Elias was not finished. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another envelope. This one was fresh, crisp white with my name printed on the front. Your grandfather left you the highway, Kimberly Elias said, handing me the envelope. But he also left you a very specific set of instructions on how to pave it. And what you read in there is going to test exactly how much you can tolerate before you break. I held the crisp white envelope Elias had just handed me. The rain battered the single window of the empty study, a relentless drumming that matched the rapid pulse in my throat. Elias did not rush me. He stood up from the floor, his knees popping slightly in the damp air, and walked over to a shallow closet built into the far wall. He pulled out a rusted metal folding chair and a square card table covered in a thick layer of dust. He set them up in the center of the room, right over the hidden safe, and wiped the surface clean with his bare hand. Bring the folders up here, he instructed, his tone shifting from mysterious to strictly professional. Let us review the architecture of your grandfather's actual legacy. I gathered the heavy legal binders from the floorboards and placed them on the table. The pages felt thick and expensive, a sharp contrast to the peeling wallpaper surrounding us. Elias opened the first binder. He traced a long, calloused finger down a list of property addresses and corporate registration numbers. Cascade Blueprint is the master holding company. Elias explained, his voice low and precise. And this exact house, the one your family laughed at today, is its legally registered corporate headquarters. I stared at the dense legal jargon. The words blurred together under the dim gray light filtering through the window. I do not understand, I said, leaning closer to the table. Jessica inherited the freight subsidiaries. The lawyer read it clearly. She and Brad own Morris Freight. Dad got the liquid cash. How does this holding company fit into that puzzle? Elias smiled. It was the thin, predatory curve that changed the entire landscape of his face. Yes, he said softly. Jessica inherited the operating companies. She owns the trucks. She owns the branding. She is responsible for the payroll, the driver insurance, and the daily headaches of moving cargo. But Cascade Blueprint owns the commercial land those warehouses sit on. He flipped to the next tab in the binder, revealing a stack of patent registrations and software licensing agreements. Cascade Blueprint owns the intellectual property, he continued. It owns the proprietary logistics software every single dispatcher in those warehouses uses to route shipments. It owns the commercial fleet licenses that allow those trucks to cross state lines. Your grandfather left them the cars, Kimberly, but he left you the highway. The breath caught in my throat. I looked around the dusty room, seeing it with entirely new eyes. The dilapidated dump I was standing in was not a punishment. It was the absolute control center of the entire Morris family wealth. I thought back to a family dinner 3 years ago. I had spent weeks developing a proposal to streamline the routing software at my job, hoping to save my company thousands in fuel costs. When I excitedly mentioned it over dessert, Jessica rolled her eyes. She told me to leave the nerdy details to the IT department and focus on finding a husband before I turned 30. Brad had laughed, pouring himself more wine. Charles had been sitting at the head of the table cutting his steak in silence. He never defended me out loud, but he was listening. He knew Jessica only cared about the prestige of the executive title, while I actually understood how the engine worked. As of this morning, Elias said, closing the binder with a firm snap, you are the sole managing member of Cascade Blueprint. You hold 100% of the voting rights. I sank into the rusted metal folding chair. The cold metal bit into my damp sweater. "How much is it worth?" I asked. My voice sounded small, fragile against the weight of the room. "The commercial land value, the fleet licensing rights, and the software patents are currently appraised at approximately $42 million, Elias said calmly. $42 million. I make $55,000 a year. I buy my work shoes on clearance. I budget my groceries down to the dollar to make sure I can cover my rent in Seattle." The number Elias just spoke did not even feel real. It sounded like a distance between planets, but the gravity of it was pressing down on my shoulders, heavy and undeniable. "You own the infrastructure," Elias reminded me, tapping the cover of the binder. "Your sister cannot move a single truck out of those loading docks without paying licensing fees and rent to this holding company. She works for you now." I looked down at the white envelope still resting in my hands. "Then why this?" I asked. "Why hide it in a safe under a floorboard? Why not just leave it to me openly and let them know the truth at the law office?" Elias pointed to the envelope. "Open it." I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of stationery. It was Charles's handwriting, the same sharp, sloping letters from the phone number, but written with much more detail. "Kimberly." The letter began, "Money ruins the weak and arms the strong. I have spent my life building a fortress, but a fortress is only as secure as the person guarding the gate. Your father and sister believe they have won. I need you to watch them. I need you to see who they become when they think they have unchecked power and you have nothing. Protect the infrastructure." I looked up at Elias. He nodded, anticipating my question. "Charles built a strict condition into the transfer of these assets," Elias explained. "You have 90 days to observe them. A 3-month observation period where you are legally forbidden from disclosing your ownership of Cascade Blueprint. You cannot tell your father. You cannot tell Jessica. You cannot even tell your mother. If you break this silence before the 90 days expire, the holding company transfers to a charitable trust, and you lose everything. You must return to your life." Elias continued, his gaze locking onto mine. "You will go back to your apartment. You will go to your logistics job. You will let them believe you inherited a worthless piece of rotting wood. Let us see how they treat you when they think they hold all the cards." I stared at the letter. Watch them. The directive was so simple yet so dangerous. My family was already arrogant. Giving them millions of dollars and the illusion of total control was like pouring gasoline on a fire. They would not just gloat. They would try to dominate everyone around them. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. The fear that had gripped me in the car was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at the peeling wallpaper and the scuffed floorboards. This house was not a tomb. It was a command center. "I accept the terms," I told Elias. He gave a brief, satisfied nod and began packing the binders back into his leather briefcase. He locked the fireproof safe, secured the floorboard back into place, and we walked back out into the freezing rain. Elias drove away in his gray sedan, leaving me standing in the gravel driveway. I climbed back into my Subaru and turned the key. The engine sputtered before catching a stark reminder of the life I still had to pretend to live. I was a multimillionaire, but tomorrow was Monday. I had to go back to my cubicle and route freight shipments. But the real problem was not my job. The real problem was my family. Jessica now believed she was the reigning queen of Morris Freight. She thought she was untouchable. And I knew exactly how she treated people she viewed as beneath her. The 90-day clock had started ticking, and I was about to find out just how ruthless my own blood could be. I drove back to Seattle in a state of suspended animation. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the harsh orange glow of the highway streetlights. I gripped the steering wheel of my Subaru, the heater blowing warm air across my damp clothes. Less than 4 hours ago, I was sitting in a dusty room tracing my grandfather Charles' signature on a master deed. The friction of my finger against the heavy paper had felt like striking a match in a dark cavern. I parked in the cramped lot of my apartment complex. I walked up 3 flights of concrete stairs to my unit, the key stuck in the deadbolt just like it always did. I pushed the door open to my 500-square-foot reality. My kitchen consisted of a single laminate counter, a microwave, and a refrigerator that hummed a low, erratic tune. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and sat on my second-hand sofa. The duality of my existence felt almost crushing. I was no longer just a logistics coordinator budgeting for groceries and buying work shoes on clearance. I was the managing member of Cascade Blueprint. I was the landlord to my own arrogant family. The land value and licensing rights were worth $42 million. Yet sitting in my quiet apartment, looking at a faint water stain on my ceiling, the only thing that felt real was the heavy silence of the 90-day clause. I want to pause here for a second. If you have ever sat in silence while the people who are supposed to love you bragged about things they did not earn, I need you to do something. Drop the words "I have been there" in the comments. Let me know I am not speaking into a void. It is a very specific type of exhaustion. Watching someone boast about a victory that was handed to them on a silver platter while you are penalized for actually putting in the work. The weekend passed in a blur of restless energy and strict discipline. Monday morning arrived with the unforgiving buzz of my alarm clock at 5:30. I put on my usual work attire, a pair of dark slacks and a sensible gray blouse, and drove to the freight dispatch center. My office was a far cry from the mahogany suites downtown where the will was read. It was a sprawling open floor plan filled with the relentless noise of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and dispatchers shouting over each other to confirm loading dock times. The air smelled of burnt coffee and ozone from the laser printers. I took my seat at a dual-monitor workstation and logged into the logistics network. My job is to track shipments across the Pacific Northwest. I monitor weather patterns, weigh station delays, and driver hours. I stare at grids of data and find the most efficient path from point A to point B. I am good at it. I understand the rhythm of the supply chain. I understand how a single missed detail can cause a catastrophic failure down the line. At 10:15, my cell phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, bracing myself for whatever performance Jessica had prepared for the morning. "Kimmy Jessica," said her voice bright and brittle. "I hope I am not interrupting your little warehouse shift. I am at my desk, Jessica. What do you want?" She sighed, a dramatic flutter of breath meant to convey how exhausted she was by her new, highly important responsibilities. "Brad and I are just swamped. We spent the entire weekend looking over the financials for Morris Freight. It is honestly a disaster. Grandpa ran this place like a dinosaur. We are already bringing in consultants to streamline the whole operation." I kept my eyes on my monitor. Brad ran a boutique marketing firm into the ground 3 years ago. My parents had bailed him out and blamed the economy to save face at their country club. Now the same man was making operational decisions for a statewide freight network. "Streamline how?" I asked, keeping my tone strictly neutral. "Oh, cutting the fat," Jessica replied breezily, the sound of a luxury espresso machine hissing in the background. "Brad noticed we are paying exorbitant licensing fees for the dispatch software. He said we can just switch to a cheap off-the-shelf application and save a fortune. Plus, we are renegotiating the union contracts. The drivers are overpaid." My stomach tightened. They were not just arrogant. They were reckless. The routing software she was complaining about was the exact software my holding company owned. It was a proprietary system Charles had developed a decade ago. It was bulletproof, designed specifically for the unique terrain hazardous material protocols and Department of Transportation regulations of the region. The licensing fees she wanted to cut were paid directly to Cascade Blueprint. They were the rent for the digital infrastructure that kept her trucks moving legally and safely. If they canceled those payments, they would default on the master lease. And if they messed with the driver pay structures, they would trigger a strike within weeks. "You cannot just swap out enterprise logistics software overnight," I warned her, the professional side of my brain taking over my mouth before I could stop it. "The migration alone takes months. You will lose cargo tracking. You will incur federal fines." Jessica let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Please, Kim. You coordinate a few trucks for a mid-tier company. Do not try to explain corporate strategy to me. Brad has a business degree. We know what we are doing. I actually called because Mom is hosting a dinner on Friday to celebrate our new executive roles. She wants you there. Try to wear something nice. We are having the event catered." The line went dead before I could reply. I set the phone down on my desk. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed. My coworker in the next cubicle slammed a drawer shut. They were going to destroy the operating companies. Grandpa Charles knew this would happen. He knew Jessica and Brad would mistake cost-cutting for innovation. They looked at a well-oiled machine and only noticed the price of the oil. They were about to strip the engine blind. Under normal circumstances, I would have intervened. I would have driven to their office, laid out the spreadsheets, and forced them to see the impending disaster. I had spent my entire life fixing their mistakes, cleaning up their messes, and acting as the family safety net. I was the one who made sure the bills were paid and the appointments were kept. But the 90-day clause bound my hands. Protect the infrastructure, Charles had written in his letter. The infrastructure was safe. The patents, the real estate, and the licenses belonged to me. The operating companies, however, were entirely vulnerable to Jessica's hubris. If they stopped paying the software fees, they would violate the covenant of their inheritance. The trap was no longer just a hypothetical concept on a piece of paper in a dusty room. Jessica was actively marching into it, carrying a gasoline can and a book of matches. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I decided not to be the safety net. I opened my personal email and drafted a message to Elias Thorne. Mr. Thorne. I typed the keys clacking softly under my fingers. Monitor the software licensing accounts for Morris Freight. I anticipate a deliberate disruption in their payment schedule. I hit send. The satisfaction that washed over me was cold and quiet. I spent the rest of my shift tracking shipments, playing the part of the struggling sister perfectly. They thought I was trapped in a dead-end job, drowning in the taxes of a moldy house. They had no idea I was sitting back holding the timer, waiting for them to detonate their own empire. The first 60 days of the observation period felt like watching a slow-motion car crash from a reinforced bunker. The Morris family did not just spend their inheritance, they weaponized it. They treated their new wealth as a blunt instrument designed to command attention and demand respect from people they considered peers. My parents were the first to make a public display of their new liquid assets. Richard and Diane purchased a luxury yacht, docking it at a premier slip in a Kirkland marina on Lake Washington. They christened it the Rightful Heir. The name alone was a masterclass in passive arrogance. Every weekend they hosted catered brunches on the aft deck, inviting other Bellevue socialites to drink imported champagne and admire the polished teak floors. My father bought a captain hat he never actually wore, preferring to leave it on the dining table as a prop to spark conversation. My mother hired a private chef to prepare expensive hors d'oeuvres, while she talked loudly about the heavy burdens of managing a family legacy. They were performing a nautical lifestyle they knew nothing about, fueled entirely by the cash Charles had left them. Jessica and Brad took a different route. They wanted to project the image of modern corporate titans, innovators who were too important to be bothered with the gritty details of logistics. Within 2 weeks of the will reading, they traded their sensible sedans for matching matte black Teslas. They began taking frequent lavish trips to Cabo San Lucas, charging the flights and resorts to the company accounts. Jessica posted endless photos on social media, staging her laptop next to a resort infinity pool with long captions about executive retreat synergy and strategizing the future of regional freight. They were treating a statewide trucking and logistics network like a flashy tech startup built on endless venture capital. Meanwhile, my daily routine remained untouched by the fortune hidden under the floorboards of the Bellingham house. I woke up at 5:30 every morning. I packed a tuna sandwich and an apple into a brown paper bag. I drove my reliable Subaru through the heavy Seattle gridlock to my dispatch job. I sat in a loud office with buzzing fluorescent lights, watching my coworkers stress over rising rent prices, while I carried the secret knowledge that I could buy the entire office building if I chose to. But I kept my head down. I played the part Charles needed me to play. I watched them. The dynamic between my family and me shifted significantly during those 2 months. Before the inheritance, they largely ignored me, treating me as a useful but dull background character. Now they actively sought me out, not to include me in their new lives, but to make sure I knew exactly how far beneath them I remained. The clearest example happened on a damp Tuesday night. I was sitting on my second-hand sofa eating a bowl of soup when my cell phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen displayed my mother Diane calling. She rarely called me unless she needed someone to organize a contractor repair or pick up a prescription she forgot. I answered the phone, letting the open silence prompt her to speak first. "Kimberly," she said, her voice echoing slightly likely on speakerphone from the spacious kitchen of her estate. "I am just checking in. We have not seen you since the lawyer office. How is the shack holding up in this rain?" "It is standing," I replied, keeping my tone flat and uninteresting. "Well, do not let it collapse on you," she sighed, the sound of ice clinking in a glass filtering through the receiver. "I actually called to share some good news. Your father and I are just so proud of Brad and Jessica. Brad is restructuring the warehouses. He brought in a team of consultants, and they are already bringing in real revenue. It is incredible what a sharp business mind can do with a stagnant company. Charles really held them back all these years." I stirred my soup, watching the steam curl toward the ceiling. "Revenue?" I asked softly. "Yes," Diane chirped, her voice thick with pride. "Liquid capital. They are breathing new life into the operation. In fact, Jessica and I were talking today. We know you are probably drowning in property taxes for that tragic little house Charles dumped on you. Jessica might be willing to hire you as a front desk receptionist at the main logistics hub. It would be a pay cut from your current job, but she could arrange a small personal loan to help you fix the roof. Consider it a family favor." I smiled into the phone. The expression was genuine, though it had nothing to do with gratitude. They thought they were throwing a life preserver to a drowning woman. They did not realize I owned the ocean. "I appreciate the offer," I said, my voice steady and polite. "But I think I will manage on my own for now." "Suit yourself," my mother replied, her tone sharpening with immediate annoyance at my refusal to grovel. "Do not say we never offered to help when the city finally condemns that property." She hung up, leaving the dial tone ringing in my ear. I set the phone aside and finished my dinner. I did not feel angry. I felt an eerie, profound calm. My mother believed Brad was a financial genius generating sudden revenue. But I knew the truth because I had spent my lunch break that very afternoon sitting in the back booth of a quiet diner with Elias Thorne. Elias had brought a slim leather folio containing the updated financial ledgers for Morris Freight. As the managing director of the holding company that owned their entire infrastructure, I had strict legal access to the master lease audits and vendor payment schedules. We drank black coffee while Elias laid out the spreadsheets on the Formica table. The numbers printed on those pages told a story that contradicted every single photo Jessica posted from her Cabo retreats. "They are not restructuring the company," Elias had explained, tracing a pen down a long column of red figures. "Brad is cannibalizing it." I studied the documents, my logistics training making quick work of the balance sheets. Brad had not discovered a magical new revenue stream. He was taking out exorbitant high-interest commercial loans against the operating companies. He was using the freight subsidiaries as collateral to borrow fast cash, which he and Jessica were then siphoning into their personal accounts disguised as executive bonuses and strategy expenses. The Teslas, the resort trips, the consultants, the lavish dinners, it was all funded by toxic debt. They were bleeding cash at an alarming rate. To sustain their illusion of wealth, they had stopped paying their vendors. But much more importantly, they had stopped paying their infrastructure costs. "They canceled the software licensing autodraft 3 weeks ago," Elias noted, tapping the bottom of the page with his pen. "And they just missed their second consecutive commercial rent payment for the warehouse land." I looked at the dates on the spreadsheet. The trap Charles designed was brilliant in its simplicity. He gave them enough rope to secure their own fate. By failing to pay the licensing and rent fees to Cascade Blueprint, Jessica and Brad were violating the core covenants of their operating rights. They were legally required to maintain those payments to keep the trucks running. "How much time do they have left?" I asked Elias, staring at the growing deficit. "The master lease stipulates a 90-day grace period for delinquent payments," Elias replied, closing the leather folio and sliding it back into his battered briefcase. "If the balance is not settled by the 90th day, The holding company has the legal authority to initiate eviction proceedings and revoke all software access. They will be locked out of their own warehouses and blinded to their own freight routes overnight. The math aligned perfectly with the observation period Charles had mandated in his letter. The clock was ticking down on both fronts simultaneously. My 90 days of required silence would expire on the exact same week their master lease entered default. Sitting in my apartment, recalling the diner conversation with Elias, my mother bragging on the phone felt pathetic. She was celebrating the illusion of success while the foundation literally crumbled beneath her feet. They were entirely oblivious to the impending deadline. They thought they had outsmarted a man who built a statewide empire from scratch. The coming weeks would require supreme discipline. I had to continue packing my tuna sandwiches. I had to continue driving my older car. I had to nod and smile while they paraded their borrowed wealth in front of me, treating me like a peasant who should be grateful for a receptionist job. I had to let them exhaust every available resource they had, pushing themselves deeper into a financial corner of their own making. The conflict was no longer a theoretical exercise hidden in a dusty room in Bellingham. The financial guillotine was raised. The master lease was coming due, the debts were compounding, and the only question left was how spectacular the crash would be when the blade finally fell. By the middle of the third month, the cracks in Jessica and Brad's manufactured reality grew too wide to ignore. The luxury vehicles and executive retreats had drained their initial capital. The short-term commercial loans they took out were coming due, and their creditors wanted proof of collateral. According to the documents Elias Thorne showed me, Brad attempted to refinance the debt by leveraging the 3 freight warehouses. He walked into a bank expecting to walk out with millions in fresh capital. Instead, the loan officer handed him a harsh geography lesson. Brad and Jessica discovered they did not own the real estate. They only owned the trucks, the payroll liabilities, and a staggering amount of debt. Panic is a dangerous catalyst. When cornered, capable people evaluate their mistakes and pivot. Incompetent people look for a scapegoat. Jessica had spent her entire childhood doing the latter. When we were kids, if she broke a toy, she would not ask for a new one. She would simply walk into my room and take mine. If I complained, my parents told me to share. Jessica never outgrew that instinct. Now facing financial ruin, she needed quick cash, and she could not sell the warehouses. So she looked at the only other asset left on the board. She looked at me. It started on a Thursday. I opened the mailbox at my apartment complex and found a thick manila envelope bearing the official seal of the City of Bellingham Municipal Code Enforcement Division. I carried it upstairs, setting my work bag on the floor, and tore open the flap. The paperwork inside was a formal notice of a hazard inspection. An anonymous citizen had filed an urgent petition claiming the Craftsman house was structurally unsound, infested with black mold, and posed an imminent danger to the surrounding neighborhood. The petition demanded the city condemn the property. At first glance, it looked like the work of a nosy neighbor annoyed by an overgrown yard. But I remembered a very specific clause in our grandfather's estate planning. Years ago, Charles established a secondary family trust to manage rural land holdings. That trust contained a bizarre, archaic loophole. If any residential property within the trust was formally condemned by a municipality, it triggered a mandatory liquidation clause to protect the family from liability. The condemned property would be forced into a public auction within 30 days. Jessica did not care about neighborhood safety. She knew about the loophole. If the city condemned my house, I would lose the deed. The property would go to a quiet auction. Jessica planned to use the last of her business credit to buy the land for pennies, bulldoze the house, and flip the commercial zoned dirt to a developer for a rapid 6-figure payout. She needed that cash to appease her creditors. She was willing to orchestrate the theft of my only inheritance to cover her own reckless spending. I did not panic. I put the paperwork on my kitchen counter, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight back up Interstate 5. The sky was clear and cold that morning, a stark contrast to the driving rain of my first visit. When I turned onto the gravel driveway, a white municipal truck was parked near the overgrown bushes. A man in a high-visibility vest stood near the sagging front steps, holding a digital tablet and snapping photos of the peeling paint and the uneven roofline. I parked my Subaru blocking his exit and walked across the damp grass. The inspector turned, lowering his tablet. He had the tired eyes of a city worker who spent his days dealing with angry landlords. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice even and professional. The inspector glanced at his screen. "I am looking for the property owner. We received an expedited hazard complaint regarding the structural integrity of this building. I need to document the exterior decay before we issue a formal citation." "I am the owner," I told him. "My name is Kimberly Morris." He sighed, swiping through a digital form. "Look, Ms. Morris, I do not want to make your life difficult, but the complaint filed was highly detailed. They cited foundation rot, unsafe load-bearing walls, and severe roof degradation. Based on the exterior alone, it is not looking good. If the inside matches the outside, I will have to tag it." I crossed my arms to block the morning chill. "I work in logistics," I said. "I deal with compliance reports and safety audits every day." A complaint that detailed does not come from a passing neighbor. It comes from someone trying to build a specific legal narrative. "Who filed the tip?" The inspector shifted his weight. "The system logs it as anonymous. We are not supposed to disclose the origin of these claims." I took a step closer. "The wood on that porch is weathered, but the foundation is solid concrete poured in the 20s. The roof needs shingles, but the trusses are intact. Whoever called this in has not been inside this house, and they are using your department to force a real estate sale under false pretenses. That is a fraudulent use of municipal resources." The inspector looked at the house, then back at me. He was a civil servant, not a pawn for corporate sabotage, and my calm certainty made him hesitate. He tapped his screen a few times, pulling up the raw intake log. "It was a phone call," he said, his voice dropping lower. The caller refused to give a name, but the caller ID pinged back to a corporate switchboard. "Which one?" I asked, though my pulse was already drumming the answer against my ribs. The inspector cleared his throat. It traced back to the main dispatch line for Morris Freight. I stared at the white municipal truck, letting the silence stretch across the cold morning air. Morris Freight. My sister. Jessica had sat in that downtown law office and told me to enjoy the mold. She had smiled at my mother dinner and offered me a receptionist job, like a benevolent queen throwing bread to a peasant. But behind the scenes, she was orchestrating the destruction of my property. She was not just greedy, she was predatory. She saw me as weak, and she believed weak things existed to be consumed. I looked at the inspector. "Give me 3 weeks," I said. "I will hire a structural engineer. I will have a certified independent report on your desk proving this building is up to code. Do not tag the property today." He studied my face, perhaps recognizing the quiet resolve of someone who refused to be bullied. He nodded once. "You have 21 days, Ms. Morris. After that, I have to follow protocol." He walked back to his truck and drove away, the crunch of the gravel echoing in the quiet neighborhood. I stood alone on the lawn looking up at the house. My grandfather had told me to watch them. He wanted me to see who they became when they thought they held the power. The observation period had served its purpose. I had seen enough. My family was willing to strip me of everything I owned just to buy themselves another month of luxury. The illusion of their wealth was crumbling, and their desperation was making them dangerous. But they were playing a game without knowing the rules. Jessica thought she was stealing a piece of worthless dirt. She did not know she was trying to condemn the legal headquarters of the holding company that owned her entire life. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and typed a quick message to Elias Thorne. "The observation phase is over," I wrote. "Prepare the default notices." I slid the phone away and walked back to my car. My parents were hosting a Thanksgiving dinner the following week. They had invited extended family, neighbors, and business associates to show off their yacht and their newfound status. Jessica would be there wearing expensive clothes paid for by toxic debt, smiling for the cameras. They wanted a captive audience. They wanted a stage to project their dominance. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. But the script was about to change. I left the city inspector standing in the damp gravel of the Bellingham driveway and drove straight south toward Seattle. I did not call Jessica to scream. I did not call my parents to demand an explanation. Screaming is what people do when they have no leverage. Noise is a cheap substitute for power. I had the power, so I only needed silence. I navigated the heavy midday traffic on Interstate 5, my mind operating with the cold efficiency of a freight manifest. In supply chain logistics, you do not throw a tantrum when a route gets blocked. You recalculate the variables. Jessica had just introduced a hostile variable into the equation. She had tried to manipulate a municipal code enforcement officer to condemn my property. She wanted to force a liquidation auction so she could steal the land and flip it to a developer for quick cash. I did not drive to my apartment. I drove to the historic Pioneer Square district in downtown Seattle. I parked my Subaru on a steep cobblestone street and walked toward a modest, unmarked brick building. This was where Elias Thorne worked. There were no floor-to-ceiling glass windows here. There were no receptionists offering sparkling water. Elias operated out of a practical, discreet office that smelled like roasted coffee and old legal volumes. It was the kind of place where real work was done far away from the performative wealth my family craved. I walked through his door without an appointment. Elias was sitting behind a heavy steel desk reviewing a stack of property surveys. He looked up, assessing my demeanor instantly. I told him about the white municipal truck, the hazard complaint, and the anonymous tip that traced back to the Morris Freight dispatch line. Elias did not look surprised. He did not gasp or offer empty sympathy. He simply closed his folder, stood up, and walked over to a row of gray filing cabinets lining the far wall. "Your sister is running out of options," Elias said, his voice calm and methodical. "She is drowning in short-term commercial debt, and her creditors are demanding collateral she does not possess. She needs liquidity, and she thinks that rotting house is her easiest target." He pulled a thick, heavy ledger from the top drawer and carried it back to the desk. He opened it flat, smoothing a page marked with a red adhesive tab. "Charles drafted these master lease agreements a decade ago," Elias explained, turning the ledger toward me. "He built specific tripwires into the operating contracts to ensure the infrastructure remained protected. Your sister and your brother-in-law just tripped the final wire." I pulled up a chair and leaned over the desk. "Let us look at the math," I said. Elias traced a pen down a long column of dates and payment histories. "They have violated 3 distinct covenants of the operating agreement," he noted. "First, they missed the quarterly licensing fee for the proprietary logistics software. That software is the central nervous system of their entire operation. Second, they allowed the commercial liability insurance on the heavy fleet to lapse into a grace period. That triggers an automatic penalty clause under the master lease. Third, and most importantly, they are now exactly 90 days delinquent on the commercial property rent for all 3 warehouse locations." I looked at the final sum at the bottom of the column. "My daily job requires me to process fuel surcharges, driver pay scales, and maintenance budgets. I understand how quickly debt compounds when you ignore it." The numbers on Elias' ledger were catastrophic. Jessica and Brad owed Cascade Blueprint $450,000 in back rent and intellectual property fees, nearly $500,000. Growing up, my parents always praised Jessica for her brilliance because she knew how to manipulate retail return policies and negotiate luxury car leases. But she never understood scale. She thought skipping a lease payment to a silent holding company was like ignoring a cable bill. She did not realize that in the commercial transport industry, defaulting on your infrastructure triggers an immediate asset freeze. I tapped the final number with my index finger. "That is why they called the city inspector today," I said, the entire picture snapping into sharp focus. "Jessica cannot borrow any more money against the trucks. The banks know she is over-leveraged. She needs cash right now to pay her creditors before they repossess her fleet. She thinks if she forces the sale of the Bellingham property, she can flip the commercial dirt for a quick $500,000. She is trying to steal my house to pay her rent." Elias nodded, leaning back in his chair. She is trying to steal the corporate headquarters to pay the corporate holding company without realizing they are the exact same entity. It is a closed loop of financial incompetence, and it gives us the right to act. For 3 months, I had played the role of the quiet, dependable sister. I had packed my tuna sandwiches. I had ignored their thinly veiled insults. I had let them parade their matte black Teslas and their $1 million yacht. But watching my own sister weaponize the local government to steal the only thing she thought I owned crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. Let us stop playing defense, I told Elias, my voice dropping to an ice-cold register. Elias pulled a fresh sheet of heavy legal paper from his desk drawer. We spent the next 2 hours drafting a formal notice of default. It was a flawless, airtight document. It outlined the 3 specific covenant violations. It detailed the exact sum of $450,000. And it set a strict 24-hour deadline for a wire transfer to clear the holding company account. If the funds were not received, the document stated that Cascade Blueprint would initiate immediate eviction proceedings. We would lock the warehouse gates. We would disable the dispatch software. The trucks would be stranded in the loading bays, and the operating companies would be entirely paralyzed before the morning shift even clocked in. Elias reviewed the document one last time, checking the legal citations. He printed the final copy and reached for a certified mail envelope. I will have a bonded courier serve this to Jessica at the Morris Freight corporate office tomorrow morning, he said. I reached across the desk and placed my hand firmly over the envelope. No, I said. Do not mail it. Do not send a courier. Send a yo. Elias looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. Legal protocol dictates formal service, Kimberly. We need a documented chain of custody to enforce the eviction. I shook my head. My family is hosting a Thanksgiving dinner next Thursday at the Bellevue estate, I explained. My mother has spent a month planning it. They have invited our extended relatives, their country club friends, and a dozen business associates. Jessica is bringing her new corporate consultants. My father hired a private catering team. They designed this event specifically to show off their new wealth to the neighborhood. I pulled the printed notice of default across the desk and slid it into my work bag. If we send a courier to her office on a Tuesday morning, Jessica will hide this document in a desk drawer. She will lie to the family about why the business failed. She will blame the economy. She will blame the drivers' union. She will probably even blame Grandpa Charles. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. I am not giving them the shadows to hide in anymore. They wanted a captive audience to witness their success. They wanted a stage. I am going to give them one. I am going to deliver this document myself, and I am going to hand it to my sister in front of every single person she is trying to impress. Elias leaned back in his chair. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first one I had seen since the day we met on the rotting porch in Bellingham. Charles told me you had his spine, Elias said quietly. I will prepare the eviction filings with the county clerk, so they are ready to execute the moment your deadline expires. I thanked him and walked out of the brick building into the fading Seattle afternoon. The cold air felt sharp and clean in my lungs. The calculation was done. The math was verified. There was no more waiting and no more hiding. The next time I saw my family, I would not be the quiet sister in the gray cardigan sitting in the background. I would be the landlord collecting her due. And I was fully prepared to serve it right alongside the Thanksgiving turkey. I drove across the floating bridge toward Bellevue on Thursday afternoon. The sky over Lake Washington was a pale, bruised purple, and the November wind pushed against the side of my Subaru. My leather work bag sat on the passenger seat. Inside that bag rested the formal notice of default printed on heavy bonded paper. It was the lever that would dismantle my family's entire financial facade. I just had to wait for the right moment to pull it. When I turned onto my parents' street, I found a line of luxury vehicles parked along the manicured curbs. My father had hired a private valet service for a family holiday. A young man in a black vest opened my car door. He looked at my older sedan, then looked at the sprawling stone facade of the Bellevue estate, trying to reconcile how I fit into the picture. I handed him the keys and walked up the aggregate concrete path to the front doors. The entryway smelled of roasted rosemary and expensive floor wax. There was no chaotic family cooking happening in the kitchen. My mother had hired a boutique catering company to handle the meal. Waiters in crisp white aprons carried silver trays of champagne flutes through the living room. The house was packed. My parents had invited extended cousins I had not seen since high school, neighbors from their gated community, and several business associates they wanted to impress. I wore a simple black dress and carried a pumpkin pie in a plastic clamshell container from a local grocery store. It was a deliberate choice. I knew my mother would hate it. Diane intercepted me near the coat closet. She wore a deep emerald velvet gown that looked heavy and restrictive. She looked at the plastic container in my hands as if I had just carried a live raccoon into her foyer. "Kimberly," Diane whispered, taking the pie and immediately handing it to a passing caterer with a frantic wave of her hand. "We have a French pastry chef handling the dessert course. Please tell me you did not bring that in front of the Hendersons." I just smiled and smoothed the front of my dress. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." I walked past her into the main living room. Aunt Elaine was holding court near the fireplace. Elaine is my older sister, a woman who measures human worth in carat size and residential zip codes. She had spent my entire childhood comparing my modest achievements to Jessica's expensive hobbies. Elaine spotted me and offered a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "Look who made it," Elaine said loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "We were all so worried about you, Kimberly. Jessica told us about the terrible situation with your inheritance. A condemned house. What a nightmare for a single girl on a warehouse budget." I did not flinch. The narrative had already been planted. Jessica had spent the cocktail hour laying the groundwork for her ambush. She had painted me as the helpless, overwhelmed younger sister, drowning in municipal red tape. She was controlling the story to make her impending theft look like a rescue mission. I excused myself and walked toward the back patio. A crowd of guests stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the dark waters of Lake Washington. Brad was standing in the center of the group, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He was pointing out toward the marina, where the rightful heir was docked. He was speaking in loud, confident tones about maritime slip fees and the burden of boat maintenance. The people around him nodded in quiet reverence. They saw a young shipping magnate. I saw a man who was 90 days delinquent on his commercial rent, standing in a house paid for by a grandfather he barely respected. At 7 o'clock, the caterers announced that dinner was served. The formal dining room featured a long mahogany table set for 30 people. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the chandelier. Silver chargers rested under porcelain plates. The seating arrangement was highly calculated. My father sat at the head of the table. Jessica and Brad were seated immediately to his right in the position of honor. I was placed near the far end, sandwiched between Aunt Elaine and a neighbor I did not know. The caterers brought out the food. We ate roasted turkey, garlic, whipped potatoes, and root vegetables glazed in honey. The room buzzed with the low hum of polite conversation. People discussed golf handicaps, European vacations, and real estate markets. I ate quietly, feeling the weight of my leather work bag resting against my leg under the table. As the plates were being cleared for the dessert course, the dining room suddenly shifted. Jessica reached out and tapped her crystal water glass with a silver fork. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the murmurs. The conversation dialed down to a hush. 30 faces turned toward the front of the table. Jessica stood up. She wore a tailored white blazer that projected pure executive authority. She offered a warm, practiced smile to the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure she had every ounce of attention. "Everyone," Jessica announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Brad and I have a small announcement. We wanted to share it today because Thanksgiving is about family. It is about taking care of the people we love when they are struggling." She turned her gaze down the long table, her eyes locked onto mine. The predatory gleam in her expression was unmistakable. "As many of you know," Jessica continued, her tone dripping with a rehearsed, artificial sweetness, "our grandfather Charles left my sister a property in Bellingham. Unfortunately, the house is in a state of severe disrepair. It has become a massive financial burden for Kimberly. In fact, we recently learned the city is moving to condemn the structure entirely. It is a public hazard. A low murmur rippled through the guests. Aunt Elaine let out a soft theatrical sigh of pity. The neighbor next to me shifted uncomfortably. Kimberly works very hard at her dispatch job, Jessica said, her voice dropping into a register of deep, fabricated empathy. But municipal fines and demolition costs are crushing. Brad and I have been doing exceptionally well with the freight companies. The revenue is beyond our wildest projections. So we sat down this week and decided we need to use our success to lift up our family. Jessica reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. She held it up for the room to see. "We are not going to let my little sister drown in debt," Jessica declared. "We are going to buy the Bellingham property from her today. We will take on the demolition costs. We will handle the city inspectors. We want to take this heavy burden off her hands. We are offering her $50,000 for the deed." She slid the document across the white linen tablecloth. It passed hands down the length of the table until it stopped directly in front of my plate. It was a formal purchase agreement printed and ready for a signature. The room erupted into polite applause. The guests smiled, murmuring their approval at such a generous, selfless act. Brad leaned back in his chair, beaming with pride. My mother touched her chest, looking as though she might cry from the sheer beauty of her older daughter, Grace. My father cleared his throat. The room quieted again to hear the patriarch speak. "It is a lifeline," Kimmy Richards said. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of an executive order. "You are out of your depth with that property. You do not have the capital to fight a city condemnation. Take the money, sign the paper, let your sister handle the real estate." I looked down at the purchase agreement resting next to my water glass. The audacity of the trap was breathtaking. They had orchestrated this entire dinner party just to corner me publicly. They knew I hated making a scene. They assumed the social pressure of 30 wealthy guests staring at me would force me to lower my head, sign the paper, and accept their charity. Jessica was offering me $50,000 for a holding company asset valued at $42 million. She was trying to steal the land out from under me to save her own failing companies, and she was making the audience applaud her for the theft. The dining room was perfectly silent now. 30 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting for me to break, waiting for the quiet, dependable sister to surrender the last piece of her dignity. I felt the leather edge of my work bag pressing against my knee. The clock had run out. The ambush was executed. It was time to respond. The silence in the dining room felt heavy enough to shatter the crystal wine glasses resting on the table. 30 pairs of eyes remained locked on my face. The guests were holding their collective breath, waiting for the predictable conclusion to the performance my sister had just orchestrated. They expected me to lower my gaze, pick up the silver pen resting near my water goblet, and sign away my inheritance out of sheer embarrassment. I looked at the printed purchase agreement sitting next to my plate of untouched cranberry sauce. The document was crisp and pristine. I looked down the long expanse of the mahogany table. Jessica was radiating smugness, her chin tilted upward in a posture of total victory. Beside her, my father was radiating condescension, his arms crossed over his chest like a judge waiting for a guilty plea from a minor offender. My heart was beating a fast rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were remarkably steady. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I picked up the purchase agreement, folded it neatly in half, and placed it safely inside my leather work bag. "I appreciate the generous offer, Jessica," I said. My voice was level, carrying clearly across the quiet room without a single tremor of fear. "But I do not sign legal contracts at a dinner table. I will need my lawyer to review this first." The room shifted instantly. The collective breath released in a wave of quiet gasps and confused murmurs. Aunt Elaine blinked rapidly, her theatrical pity replaced by genuine shock. My mother dropped her hand from her chest, her expression souring into deep disapproval. Brad let out a loud, sudden snort that nearly caused him to spill his amber drink down the front of his expensive dress shirt. He slammed his glass onto the table, the sharp clink cutting through the whispers of the confused guests. "Your lawyer," Brad laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Kim, you coordinate truck routes for a living. You rent a shoebox apartment. You do not have a corporate attorney. Stop embarrassing yourself in front of our friends and just sign the paper so we can help you out of this mess." Brad grew up in a wealthy suburb of Seattle. He had coasted through his 20s on a trust fund established by his grandmother, which he managed to burn through on failed boutique business ventures before he met Jessica. He had never earned a dollar through actual physical labor. He viewed my blue-collar logistics job as a personal failing on my part, a clear sign of low ambition. He could not fathom a world where I possessed resources he did not understand or control. I turned my gaze to Brad, holding eye contact, until his mocking smirk began to falter under the weight of my stare. "I have legal representation," I assured him quietly. My father leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the white linen tablecloth. His patriarchal patience was gone, replaced by the simmering frustration he always exhibited when his authority was challenged in front of an audience. In the early days of his career, Richard Morris built his reputation by browbeating local vendors and small business owners in public forums. He used intimidation as his primary negotiating tactic. He expected me to shrink under his glare, just like those vendors did decades ago. "Kimberly, do not be foolish," my father warned, his tone dark and commanding. "You are entirely out of your depth. The city is going to condemn that eyesore of a house. The municipal fines alone will bankrupt you within a month. Your sister is offering you a lifeline that you honestly do not deserve. Take it." I did not shrink. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The legs of the chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that made several guests flinch. I smoothed the front of my black dress and picked up my wool coat from the back of the chair. "I am not signing anything tonight," I stated firmly, looking directly at my father. "I will have my attorney set up a meeting for Monday morning. We can discuss the sale of the property in a proper professional setting instead of doing business over dessert." Jessica scoffed, crossing her arms over her tailored white blazer. "Fine. Play the big executive. Send us the address for this imaginary lawyer of yours. But the generous offer drops to $40,000 on Monday. I will email you the location," I replied. I slung my work bag over my shoulder, feeling the solid weight of the notice of default pressing against my side. I looked at the extravagant spread of food, the crystal chandeliers, and the room full of people who had just spent the last 10 minutes silently judging my worth based on a lie. "Enjoy the pie," I said. I turned and walked away from the table. I did not rush. I walked with measured, deliberate steps through the formal dining room, past the sprawling living area, and out into the grand foyer. I could hear the immediate eruption of frantic whispers breaking out behind me as the guests scrambled to process the confrontation. The valet brought my older sedan around to the front of the estate. The young man looked a bit nervous, perhaps sensing the electric tension radiating from the front doors of the mansion. I handed him a $5 bill, climbed into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. The interior of my car was freezing. The November wind howled outside, pushing against the glass, but the cold felt incredible. It cleared the suffocating smell of roasted rosemary and heavy perfume from my lungs. I sat in the driveway for a moment, watching the warm light spill out from the tall windows of the Bellevue estate. Shadows moved back and forth across the glass. My parents were probably assuring their guests that I was just being stubborn and ungrateful. Brad and Jessica were probably laughing at the ridiculous idea of my imaginary lawyer, convinced I was bluffing to save face. I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket and dialed the 10-digit number. The ringing tone sounded only once before the line clicked open. Elias Thorne answered with his usual crisp efficiency. "Yes, Kimberly." "They took the bait," I said, watching the catering staff carry a tray of dirty champagne flutes past the front window. "Jessica tried to force me to sign a purchase agreement in front of 30 people. She wants to buy the Bellingham property for $50,000. A low chuckle rumbled through the phone speaker. Elias rarely laughed, but the sheer audacity of my sister and her attempt to steal the land clearly amused him. $50,000 for the corporate headquarters of a $42 million logistics empire, Elias noted. "It is almost a shame we have to wake them up from this dream." "I assume you declined the offer." "I told them I would not sign without my attorney present," I said, shifting the car into gear and pulling away from the curb. "I told them we would meet on Monday morning to finalize the paperwork." "Good," Elias replied, his voice shifting back to a serious, calculating tone. I will have the main conference room prepped at 10 o'clock. Should I activate the default protocols with the county clerk? I drove down the dark, winding roads of the wealthy neighborhood, leaving the massive stone houses behind. I thought about the 90 days I had spent eating tuna sandwiches and biting my tongue. I thought about the city inspector standing in my yard because my sister tried to manipulate the municipal code. I thought about the look on my father's face when he ordered me to sign away my inheritance to protect his golden child. Charles had warned me that money ruins the weak and arms the strong. My family had spent the last 3 months proving exactly who they were. They had proven they were reckless, greedy, and willing to cannibalize their own blood for a quick payout to save their luxury vehicles. The observation period was officially over. Activate everything I said into the phone. Elias confirmed the instructions. He explained that by tomorrow morning the legal notices would be filed securely with the local magistrate. The eviction warrants would be drawn up and held in escrow. The digital lockout for the proprietary routing software would be programmed on a time delay ready to execute the moment our deadline passed. We were assembling a financial snare, and Jessica was walking right toward it, convinced she was the one holding the trap. I drove back to my small apartment in Seattle, the heater blowing warm air over my hands. I felt a profound sense of peace settling into my chest. For the first time in my life, I was not dreading an upcoming family meeting. I was genuinely looking forward to it. I laid my work bag on the kitchen counter, knowing the legal documents inside were locked and loaded. They wanted to steal my house. Instead, they were going to lose their entire world. The rain had returned to Seattle by Monday morning, casting a flat, gray light over the cobblestone streets of Pioneer Square. I sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table inside Elias Thorne's primary conference room. I wore the same gray cardigan I had worn to the will reading 3 months ago. I folded my hands on the cool wood. My leather work bag rested by my feet. Elias stood near the window watching the street below with the quiet vigilance of a hawk. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. Jessica walked in first. She looked ready for a magazine cover shoot, wearing a sharp white blazer that stood out starkly against the muted academic tones of the law office. Her heels clicked a rapid, entitled rhythm against the hardwood floor. Brad followed her, carrying a sleek silver tablet, checking his luxury watch, as if calculating exactly how many minutes this minor inconvenience would steal from his day. My father entered last, carrying his customary leather briefcase. Richard Morris always walked into a room expecting to own it. They sauntered into the space with the casual arrogance of people who believed they were dealing with a budget strip mall attorney. They expected peeling paint and cheap plastic chairs. Instead, they found themselves in a room lined with floor-to-ceiling legal volumes and dark, expensive wood. The architecture of the room demanded respect, and for a fleeting second I saw my father hesitate. Richard stopped halfway to the table. His gaze shifted from me, sitting at the head of the boardroom, to the man standing by the window. My father recognized him. Years ago, Richard had attempted to retain Elias Thorne for a corporate merger. Elias had declined the generous retainer, citing a conflict of interest in operational ethics. My father had never forgotten the rejection. "Mr. Thorne," my father said, his voice dropping its usual booming volume. "What are you doing here representing Kimberly?" Elias stepped away from the window. He did not offer a polite smile. He did not extend a hand to shake. He picked up a thick, heavy binder from the side credenza and walked to the table. "I am not here representing Kimberly in a personal capacity," Elias replied, placing the binder flat on the polished wood. "I am here representing the managing director of Cascade Blueprint, LLC." Jessica pulled out a chair and sat down, dropping her designer handbag onto the table. She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by the legal formality. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out the folded purchase agreement from Thanksgiving dinner, smoothing it out with her manicured fingers. "Whatever shell company you want to use to process the transaction is fine with us," Jessica said, her tone dripping with bored condescension. "Brad and I brought a certified check for $50,000. We just need her signature on the deed transfer and we can all get out of here. We have a logistics network to run." Elias did not look at the check. He slid a single thick document across the mahogany table. It came to rest directly over Jessica's purchase agreement. Kimberly is not here to sell you the Bellingham property, Richard Elias said, shifting his gaze to my father. She is here to collect the rent. The room went still. The rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded deafening. Jessica frowned. She looked at the document Elias had just provided. Her eyes darted back and forth between Elias and me, her brain struggling to process the combination of words she had just heard. "Rent?" Jessica asked, her voice hitching slightly. "What rent? We own the companies. We own Morris Freight." I kept my hands folded on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I let the truth carry its own weight. "You own the trucks, Jessica," I said softly. "I own the ground they park on." Brad let out a short, dismissive scoff. He picked up the document Elias had slid across the table. "That is ridiculous," Brad sneered. "Charles left us the subsidiaries. We have the operating rights. We have been running the warehouses for 3 months. You have a condemned house with a collapsing roof." Brad was a man who only understood surface-level optics. He grew up believing that driving the nicest car in the parking lot meant you owned the building. He had spent his entire tenure at Morris Freight treating the dispatchers and drivers like disposable assets, focusing solely on the profit margins he could extract for his own lifestyle. He never bothered to read the foundational charters of the businesses he was supposed to manage. My father, however, understood corporate structure. Richard leaned over Brad's shoulder and looked at the header printed on the document. I watched my father's face transform. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The confident patriarch who had ordered me to sign away my inheritance at Thanksgiving was gone, replaced by a man staring directly into an abyss. Richard understood what Cascade Blueprint was. Charles had mentioned the holding company years ago in passing, referring to it as the Vault. Richard knew the vault contained the master leases and the intellectual property. He just never knew who held the keys. "You?" my father whispered, staring at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into his home. "Charles left the holding company to you?" "Yes," I replied. Jessica snatched the document out of Brad's hands. She scanned the bold print, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the heavy paper. The document was the formal notice of default Elias, and I had drafted the previous week. "This says we owe $450,000. Jessica read aloud, her voice rising in pitch, teetering on the edge of panic. "That is impossible. We do not owe you anything. You owe licensing fees for the proprietary logistics software your dispatchers use every single day." Elias explained, his tone clinical and unyielding. "You owe commercial rent for the 3 warehouse locations. You ceased payments on these accounts 90 days ago. Your master lease stipulates a 90-day cure period. That period expired at midnight." Jessica slammed her hand on the table. "We stopped paying those fees because they were redundant. We were restructuring the overhead. The consultants told us we could migrate to a cheaper system. You cannot migrate a statewide logistics network while actively hauling freight," I told her, drawing on my decade of supply chain experience. "The software you tried to cut is tied directly to your Department of Transportation compliance modules. Without it, your trucks cannot legally cross the way stations. By canceling the payments to my holding company, you blinded your own fleet." Brad stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards. "This is extortion." He pointed a trembling finger at Elias. "You engineered this. You hid this from us at the will reading so you could trap us in this default. We will take you to court. We will sue you for fraud." Elias remained perfectly calm. "There was no fraud, Mr. Morris. The transfer of the operating rights was executed flawlessly. You simply failed to read the covenants attached to the assets you inherited. You assumed ownership of the vehicles without verifying who owned the roads." Jessica stared at the notice of default. Her breathing grew shallow. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. The crisp white blazer suddenly looked like a straitjacket. She had spent the last 3 months taking out short-term commercial loans, using the freight companies as collateral. She had bought a matte black Tesla. She had flown to Cabo. She had funded an illusion with money she did not actually possess, banking on the revenue of a company she was simultaneously starving to death. "You set us up!" Jessica hissed, her voice trembling with rising fury. You sat there for 3 months. You ate lunch in your cheap little car and let us spend the money. You knew we were missing the payments and you did not say a word. I looked at my sister. I thought about the city inspector standing in the gravel driveway of the Bellingham house. I thought about the anonymous tip she called in, trying to manipulate the municipal code to condemn my property and force a liquidation auction. She was willing to destroy my life to cover her own debts, and now she was playing the victim. I reached into my leather work bag and pulled out the sealed envelope Charles had left me. I set it on the mahogany table. Grandpa built a 90-day silence clause into the transfer of the holding company, I said, keeping my gaze locked on Jessica. He ordered me to watch you. He knew you would take the operating cash and run the companies into the ground. He wanted to see who you would become when you thought you held all the power and I had nothing. I pushed the notice of default closer to her. You tried to condemn my property to steal the land, I said, my voice hardening into stone. You tried to humiliate me in front of 30 people at a holiday dinner. You proved exactly why Charles put me in charge of the foundation and put you in charge of the decoration. My father slowly sank into the empty chair beside Brad. He stared at the polished mahogany table, the reality of the financial devastation settling over his shoulders. His $4 million liquid inheritance was tied up in a depreciating yacht and bad stock investments. To save Jessica companies and protect the family name from bankruptcy, he would have to liquidate everything he owned. The trap was not just a legal document, it was a mirror, and they were finally forced to look at their own reflection. But the financial summary printed on that default notice was only the beginning. They still had to face the consequences of the deadline they had just missed. Jessica kept her eyes locked on the heavy paper resting on the mahogany table. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen gray. She read the bold print at the top of the page, her eyes darting back and forth across the legal headers. Her manicured fingernails dug into the edges of the document so hard the paper began to crease. This is a master lease agreement, Elias explained. His voice was calm and methodical, the tone of a seasoned professor, explaining a basic equation to a failing student. When you accepted the operating rights to Morris Freight 3 months ago, you legally bound yourselves to the existing infrastructure contracts. A subsidiary company cannot exist without the foundation it rests upon. Jessica shook her head, a short and frantic motion. She looked at Brad, hoping her husband would intervene and find a loophole. But Brad was staring blankly at the wall, his bravado entirely evaporated. Cascade Blueprint owns the commercial real estate. Elias continued, tapping his pen against the polished wood of the boardroom table. It owns the dispatch software. It owns the fleet patents. Every loading dock, every overnight parking lot, and every digital route your drivers use belongs to the holding company. And the Bellingham house you tried to condemn is the registered corporate headquarters of that holding company. By trying to demolish it, you were attempting to destroy your own landlord. I reached out and slid the notice of default an inch closer to Jessica. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood was the only noise in the room. You are 90 days delinquent on your licensing fees and your commercial rent, I stated. I looked away from my sister and turned my gaze directly to Brad. I wanted to address the man who thought he could streamline a logistics network by starving its central nervous system. You owe Cascade Blueprint $450,000, I said, keeping my voice level and cold. And the grace period has officially expired. That balance is payable immediately. Brad swallowed hard. He looked at his luxury watch, a nervous habit exposing his rising panic. We do not have that kind of liquidity sitting in a checking account, Kimberly. You know we do not. We took out short-term loans to cover the operational overhead. The banks are already auditing our ledgers. We need time to restructure the debt. I folded my hands on the table. You do not get time, Brad. You had 3 months to read your own operating charter. You spent those 3 months taking trips to Cabo and buying luxury cars while ignoring the invoices generated by my holding company. I leaned forward just slightly, letting the gravity of the situation settle over them. If the funds are not wired into the Cascade Blueprint holding account by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, I will initiate commercial eviction proceedings against all 3 warehouse locations, I told them. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You cannot do that. The drivers will show up for their shifts. The freight is already loaded. I can, and I will, I assured her. If that wire does not clear, I will have private security contractors change the locks on the main gates by 6 o'clock tomorrow night. But the real estate eviction is the least of your problems. I looked back at Brad. I am a supply chain coordinator, I reminded him. I know exactly how the federal regulations govern heavy freight. If you default tomorrow, I will revoke your access to the proprietary logistics software. Brad's face went entirely slack. He finally understood the mechanism of the trap. The software you stopped paying for controls the electronic logging devices inside the cab of every single truck in your fleet, I explained, laying out the precise operational reality. The Department of Transportation mandates those electronic logs. If I revoke your software license, those screens go dark. Your drivers cannot legally put the vehicles in gear. Your entire fleet will be paralyzed by Wednesday morning. The cargo will sit in the bays. Your clients will cancel their contracts, and the federal fines for non-compliance will bankrupt you before Friday. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I had laid out a flawless operational checkmate. I did not need to raise my voice. The federal regulations and the binding contracts did all the heavy lifting for me. Suddenly, my father slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot. Richard Morris was not a man who accepted defeat. In the late 90s, my father ran a local supply firm. When a rival competitor started undercutting his prices, Richard did not improve his own business model. He simply hired a team of aggressive attorneys and tied the rival up in frivolous litigation for 3 years. He drained their legal funds until they were forced to declare bankruptcy. My father viewed the legal system as a weapon, and he believed he was the only person in the room who could afford to wield it. "This is fraud," Richard shouted, pushing his chair back and standing up to tower over the table. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "You manipulated a dying man." Charles was 82 years old. He was undergoing harsh medical treatments. He was heavily medicated and clearly out of his mind when he signed those holding company documents. My father turned his glaring eyes toward me, attempting to use the same physical intimidation he used at the Thanksgiving dinner. "You are not collecting a single dime, Kimberly. We will tie you up in probate court for a decade. We will file an emergency injunction to freeze the holding company assets, pending a full investigation into his mental capacity. By the time the judge rules, your little corporate headquarters will be a pile of ash." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I just sat quietly and waited. Elias Thorne did not even blink at the outburst. He calmly reached down to his battered leather briefcase resting on the floor. He opened the brass latches and pulled out 3 separate color-coded medical folders. He placed them on the table in a neat row. Charles anticipated this exact reaction. Richard, Elias said, his voice returning to that clinical, unyielding tone. Charles knew you would attempt to invalidate his final wishes by attacking his cognitive state. He knew you would claim dementia or medication-induced confusion the moment you realized you were not in control. Elias tapped the first folder. "This is a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted 2 years ago by a board-certified neurologist." He tapped the second folder. "This is a secondary cognitive assessment performed last year by an independent specialist from a different hospital network." Elias placed his hand flat on the third folder. "And this is a final, notarized psychiatric evaluation conducted just 14 days before Charles passed away. It includes blood panels proving he was not under the influence of any altering narcotics at the time he executed the transfer of Cascade Blueprint to your daughter." Elias slid all 3 folders across the table toward my father. "All 3 independent physicians declared your father to be of perfect sound mind," Elias stated. "The medical documentation is airtight. The legal structure is impenetrable. If you attempt to file an emergency injunction, I will present these evaluations to the judge. Your petition will be dismissed with prejudice before the end of the week, and you will be held liable for all court costs." My father stared at the 3 medical folders. His hand hovered over the table, trembling slightly, but he did not pick them up. He knew what they meant. The threat of a decade-long court battle had vanished into thin air. His favorite weapon had just been dismantled in front of him. The trap had snapped entirely shut. There were no loopholes left. There were no legal maneuvers to delay the inevitable. The reality of their situation descended upon them like a physical weight. Jessica buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the panic finally overtook her pride. Brad stared at the notice of default, his mouth slightly open, calculating the ruin of his own reputation. My father slowly sank back into his leather chair, looking like a man who had just watched his entire legacy burn to the ground. They were stripped of their leverage, their wealth, and their illusions. They had exactly 24 hours to find nearly $500,000, or their executive lifestyle would end in a catastrophic public failure. The stillness in the room was absolute. It was entirely different from the quiet anticipation we experienced 3 months ago at the law office downtown. That day, the air was thick with greed and the promise of unearned wealth. Today, the atmosphere was heavy with the suffocating weight of total defeat. The air in the boardroom felt thin. Nobody moved. The 3 medical folders sitting on the table represented a steel wall my family could not climb. Brad was the first person to break the stillness. His hands were visibly shaking against the dark wood of the table. He looked at Jessica. His eyes were wide with a terror that only a man who has never faced a true consequence can exhibit. "We do not have $450,000, Kimberly," Brad said. His voice cracked mid-sentence. It was a pathetic sound. "We do not have it. We took out commercial loans to cover the daily overhead. We bought the matching Teslas. We signed a lease on a luxury condo in Cabo. Everything is leveraged." Brad had lived his entire 34 years skating on the thin ice of other people's money. His parents had shielded him from the fallout of his failed marketing firm. Jessica had shielded him by marrying him into the Morris family. He was accustomed to making bad decisions and letting someone else quietly settle the tab. But there was no one left to settle this tab. The banks had already flagged their corporate accounts. If the wire transfer did not clear the holding company by tomorrow afternoon, the federal compliance lockout would execute automatically. Brad was staring at federal bankruptcy and personal ruin. My father sat in the leather chair next to them. Richard Morris suddenly looked every single one of his 68 years. The rigid posture that defined his entire public persona dissolved. He slumped forward in his seat. He looked at Brad, and then at his golden daughter. The gears in his mind were turning with brutal precision. Richard knew the laws of commercial transport. He knew that if Morris Freight collapsed into default, the corporate veil would not protect them from the predatory lenders Jessica had courted. The creditors would come after the family estate to recoup the massive commercial loans. To save the family businesses and protect himself from the fallout, my father realized he would have to write the check. He would have to bail them out. But his $4 million liquid inheritance was gone. He had tied it up in the Kirkland Marina. He had purchased the luxury yacht. He had funneled the rest into high-risk offshore investments, hoping to double his net worth before the end of the fiscal year. To generate nearly $500,000 in cash by tomorrow afternoon, Richard would have to liquidate his prized luxury assets immediately. He would have to sell the yacht to a liquidator for a fraction of its value. He would have to swallow his immense pride and admit a catastrophic financial failure to his peers. They were entirely at my mercy. I sat at the head of the boardroom table, a supply chain coordinator making a modest salary, looking at 3 people who had spent their entire lives treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes. I held the keys to their survival. I did not feel a rush of euphoria. I felt the steady, grounded satisfaction of seeing a complex mathematical equation balance itself out perfectly. Jessica could not process the shift in power. Her brain rejected the reality of her subordination. She pushed her chair back, the legs grinding harshly against the floorboards. She stood up. Her face was flushed with a chaotic mix of humiliation and pure venom. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to tremble as she leveled a glaring stare in my direction. "You set us up!" Jessica hissed. Her voice was shaking with anger. "You sat there in your cheap clothes and let us spend the money. You knew exactly what you were doing. You let us take out the loans. You let us buy the vehicles. You let us sign the contracts. You engineered this entire disaster just to trap us. I did not let you do anything, Jessica, I replied. My voice was steady. It cut through her hysteria like a cold blade. I did not force you to apply for high-interest commercial loans. I did not force you to ignore the vendor invoices. I did not make you skip your lease payments to fund your vacations. I stood up from my chair. I wanted to meet her at eye level. I wanted her to hear every single word with absolute clarity. Grandpa Charles gave you a fortune, I said. He handed you a fully functional, highly profitable logistics empire, and you immediately used that fortune to try and steal the one dilapidated house you thought I had. Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the space. You called the city inspector to condemn my property. I continued, my tone dropping to a low, unforgiving register. You tried to weaponize the municipal code so you could force a liquidation auction and steal my land for pennies. You tried to humiliate me at Thanksgiving dinner in front of 30 people. You orchestrated a public spectacle to paint yourself as a savior while actively plotting to rob me blind. I looked at her, seeing right through the expensive white blazer and the designer handbag. You proved exactly why Grandpa put me in charge of the foundation, I told her. And he put you in charge of the decoration. Decorations are easy to replace. Foundations hold the entire structure together. Jessica staggered back slightly, as if the words carried physical weight. She looked toward our father, seeking the validation and protection she had relied upon since childhood. Daddy, she pleaded. Her voice shrank. It sounded like the voice of a spoiled child who had just broken a valuable vase. You have to help us. You have to advance us the cash from your accounts. We will pay you back. We just need to clear this default before tomorrow. Richard slowly lifted his head. The look he gave his eldest daughter contained no warmth. There was no patriarchal protection left in his eyes, only cold, calculating resentment. You fools, Richard said. His voice was a gravelly whisper. Do you have any idea what you have done? My money is tied up, the boat is docked, the market investments are locked in a penalty period. If I pull $500,000 out of my portfolio today, I will trigger massive federal tax penalties. I will lose 30% of my net worth just to cover your incompetence. But you have to? Brad interjected, his panic overriding his usual cowardice. If we default, the creditors will pierce the corporate veil. They will come after the Bellevue estate, Richard. We are all tied to the same family trust structure. If we go down, we drag you down with us. The boardroom became a battleground of a completely different nature. The unified front they had presented for the past 3 months fractured into a million pieces. My father realized he was chained to the sinking ship of Jessica and Brad. He was going to have to sell the yacht he had paraded in front of his country club friends. He was going to have to endure the social humiliation of a fire sale. The anger radiating from him was palpable. He looked at Jessica not as a daughter, but as a severe financial liability. I watched them turn on each other. The venom they had always reserved for me was now being deployed against their own ranks. I picked up my leather work bag from the floor and placed it on the table. They stopped arguing and turned their attention back to the true threat in the room. Finding the money to clear the default is your problem, I said to the 3 of them. I do not care if you sell the boat. I do not care if you sell the Teslas. I do not care if you have to pawn your designer watches. The wire transfer must clear my holding company account by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. But clearing the debt is only the first step. Jessica swallowed hard. She clutched her handbag against her chest. What do you mean the first step? What else is there? I looked at Elias Thorne. He offered a small nod of professional approval. The debt simply keeps the warehouse doors open tomorrow, I told them. But if you want to continue operating your freight company on my land, and if you want to continue using my logistics software, we are going to draft a brand new operating agreement. And my new terms are completely non-negotiable. Jessica let out a jagged, echoing sob. She covered her face with her hands, but her fingers were spread just enough to monitor my reaction. Her shoulders heaved in a theatrical display of despair. I recognized the performance instantly. It was the exact same routine she had perfected during our childhood to escape consequence. When she was 19, she borrowed our father's luxury sedan without permission and scraped the entire passenger side against a concrete parking pillar. She stood in our kitchen crying those exact same tears, her voice trembling as she blamed the narrow garage and her own fragile nerves. My parents comforted her. They paid the repair bill without a second thought and bought her a new car for graduation. She expected the same routine to work today. "Kimmy, please!" Jessica wept, her voice reaching a frantic high pitch that grated against the quiet dignity of the law office. "We are family. You cannot put us on the street. We will lose everything. The country club, the house, the friends in our neighborhood. We will be ruined. Brad will never get hired anywhere else with a corporate bankruptcy on his record." She reached across the polished wood, her hand hovering in the space between us, waiting for me to take it. Waiting for the dependable younger sister to offer a comforting smile and absorb her burdens. I looked at her outstretched hand. I felt nothing. There was no pity. There was no lingering sense of sibling loyalty. There was only the cold, sharp clarity of a ledger balancing to zero. I thought about the tuna sandwiches I packed every morning at 5:30 while she drank imported wine on a balcony in Cabo. I thought about the mocking laughs she directed at my gray cardigan in the lobby of the downtown firm. I thought about the city inspector standing in the damp gravel of my driveway, dispatched by an anonymous tip from my own sister to destroy the only asset she thought I possessed. She had tried to leave me with nothing, and now she was begging for grace. "We are family, Jessica," I said. I stood up from my chair, pushing it back so I could look down the length of the table at all three of them. "But we are also separate corporate entities. And today, the corporate entity is dictating the terms." I turned to Elias Thorne. He understood the cue perfectly. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and produced a second set of documents fresh from the printer. These pages were thicker, bound with heavy blue staples. He slid 3 copies across the table. One for Jessica, one for Brad, one for my father. This was the true endgame. Charles had warned me that money arms the strong, and I was finally using the weapons he had provided. "I am not foreclosing on you today," I told them, watching a brief, pathetic flicker of hope ignite in Jessica's eyes. "But I am restructuring your debt. You will pay the $450,000 in back rent to Cascade Blueprint. However, because you are now in default, that balance will be subject to an applied commercial interest rate of 12%. Brad picked up the new contract, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. His jaw dropped. "You are penalizing us." "I am holding you to standard market rates for high-risk tenants," I corrected him. "Furthermore, you will pay your monthly software licensing fees and your property leases on time. Every single month." I had Elias draft a new zero-tolerance default clause into this operating agreement. There is no longer a 90-day grace period. If you are 1 day late, or if a wire transfer falls short by a single dollar, Elias files the eviction with the county clerk. I paced a few steps along the side of the table, my voice echoing off the rows of legal volumes lining the walls. "The lockout executes automatically," I continued. "Your fleet will stop moving. I will liquidate the warehouses, sell the dispatch software to your largest competitor, and leave you to explain the failure to your creditors. You also grant Cascade Blueprint full auditing rights. Elias will review your ledgers every 30 days to ensure you are not hiding capital." Brad wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He dropped the contract onto the table as if the paper were burning his fingers. "You are turning us into your employees," he realized, the crushing truth finally sinking in. "We will be working 60 hours a week just to generate enough revenue to pay the holding company. We will not take home a profit for years." "You are the executives, Brad," I reminded him dryly. "You wanted the titles. You wanted the prestige of running a statewide logistics network. Now you have to earn those titles. You will cancel your executive retreats. You will sell the matching Teslas. You will sit at your desks, route those freight trucks, and run the company until the ledgers balance. You are going to learn how to actually work for a living, just like the dispatchers and drivers you look down upon." Jessica stared at the contract, her fake tears drying up, instantly replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. The party was over. The illusion was dead. She was no longer a wealthy corporate titan. She was an indentured servant to her younger sister. Then I turned my attention to my father. Richard Morris was staring at the floor, his hands still folded in his lap. He had just watched his golden child reduced to a struggling tenant, and his own retirement fund earmarked for a massive corporate bailout to keep her out of federal bankruptcy court. His pride was entirely broken. He looked up at me, attempting to muster a fraction of his patriarchal dignity. "Kimberly," my father started, his voice gravelly and stripped of its usual booming authority. "This is a harsh lesson. You have made your point. But perhaps we can move forward from this. We can discuss the auditing details over dinner this weekend. Your mother can prepare a nice meal, and we can figure out a family payment plan that does not involve public humiliation." I looked at the man who had let me be the punchline of his social circle for a decade. I looked at the man who had told me to sign away my inheritance at a Thanksgiving table just to save himself the embarrassment of dealing with his older daughter failures. "And Dad," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even and devoid of any warmth, "I am done attending family dinners where I am the joke. I am done eating dry turkey while you all count your money and mock my choices." Richard blinked, startled by the finality in my voice. "Kimmy, you do not mean that." "I mean every word," I replied. "From now on, if you want to speak to me, you go through my legal counsel." I pointed toward Elias, who stood silently by the window, the ultimate gatekeeper to my new life. "You do not call my cell phone," I decreed, drawing the final permanent boundary around myself. "My mother does not call me to brag about your imaginary successes. You do not invite me to Bellevue to use me as a prop for your wealthy friends. You do not offer me reception jobs to make yourselves feel generous." I picked up my purse from the floor. I secured my leather work bag over my shoulder. The weight of the documents inside felt different now. They were no longer a secret burden. They were a shield. "Access to my life is a privilege," I told my family, looking each of them in the eye one last time. "And none of you can afford it right now." I did not wait for an apology. An apology extracted under financial duress is just another calculated transaction, and I was done doing business with them. I turned my back on my parents and my sister. I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I grabbed the brass handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the hallway. I let the heavy door click shut behind me, leaving them sitting at the mahogany table surrounded by the wreckage of their own greed, staring at a reality they could no longer manipulate. It has been exactly 1 year since I walked out of Elias Thorne boardroom and left my family sitting in the silence of their own making. The transition into my new life did not happen overnight. I did not march into the freight dispatch center the next morning and flip my desk over in a cinematic blaze of glory. That is how things happen in television shows. In reality, sudden authority is a shock to the system, and I am a person who relies on order. I kept working my 50-hour shifts for another 2 months. I routed trucks across the Cascade Mountains. I tracked fuel surcharges and logged maintenance reports. I sat in my gray fabric cubicle and ate my tuna sandwiches while quietly reviewing commercial real estate audits on my lunch break. But the dual existence became a logistical puzzle I could no longer balance. Managing a holding company with dozens of complex commercial patents requires undivided focus. I submitted my 2 weeks' notice on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. My floor supervisor offered me a $1 an hour raise to stay, reminding me how tough the job market was for single women. I smiled, thanked him for the opportunity, and drove away from the warehouse district for the last time. My first order of business was the Bellingham property. The corporate headquarters needed to reflect the strength of the foundation beneath it. But rebuilding a neglected 1920s craftsman house presents a unique set of battles. I hired a local general contractor to handle the sagging front porch and the rotting roof. He pulled up in a heavy-duty pickup truck, took one look at me standing in the driveway in my gray cardigan, and handed me an estimate inflated by 40%. He assumed I was a naive owner who did not understand supply costs or regional labor markets. He expected me to write a check without asking questions. I did not argue with him. I simply pulled out a spreadsheet detailing the exact wholesale costs of treated timber, municipal permitting fees, and average hourly labor rates for Snohomish County. I handed the paper back to him and highlighted the specific line item discrepancies. The contractor stared at the spreadsheet, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He revised the estimate on the spot. The renovation took 6 months of mud noise and constant supervision. I replaced the peeling exterior with fresh weather-resistant siding. I reinforced the load-bearing walls. I restored the original oak floors, carefully preserving the hidden access panel in the study. While I was rebuilding a house, my family was busy dismantling their illusion. The fallout from the default notice was swift and unforgiving. My father refused to accept his new reality quietly. In February, Richard attempted a backdoor legal maneuver. He hired a forensic accounting firm to audit Cascade Blueprint, hoping to find a clerical error that would invalidate the transfer my grandfather made. He spent thousands of dollars on billable hours chasing a ghost. Elias Thorne met the accountants with ironclad ledgers and a swift cease and desist order. The failed legal attack drained the last of my father's liquid reserves. 2 weeks later, I drove past the Kirkland Marina and saw a liquidation tag hanging from the stern of the rightful heir. Richard sold the yacht at a significant loss to a wholesale broker just to cover his legal fees and keep his daughter out of federal bankruptcy court. Jessica and Brad are a different story entirely. The holding company collects the rent and the software licensing fees on the first day of every month. The wire transfers clear my accounts with brutal punctuality. To afford those payments, Jessica had to sell the matching matte black Teslas. Brad had to surrender his country club membership. They moved out of their expensive leased home and downsized to a modest suburban townhouse. They no longer take executive retreats to Cabo San Lucas to strategize. They work 60-hour weeks at the warehouse, sitting in the dispatch office they used to mock, routing the very trucks they thought they were too important to manage. Jessica handles angry client phone calls. Brad argues with diesel mechanics over repair bills. The freight business is staying afloat, but they are earning every single dollar through actual physical labor. They are learning the true cost of the dirt under their feet. Today I am sitting in the study of the Bellingham house. The rain is falling outside, drumming a steady rhythm against the new reinforced windows. The room smells like fresh pine wood stain and dark roast coffee. I replaced the rusted folding chair with a heavy leather armchair. The fireproof safe is still secured under the floorboards, holding the master deeds that changed the trajectory of my life. I am telling you this story today because I know someone out there is listening to this while sitting in the background of their own life. You are the dependable one. You are the person who organizes the medical files, pays the utility bills, and absorbs the subtle insults just to keep the peace at the holiday dinner table. You are letting other people draw the borders of your worth because they speak with authority and drive nicer cars. You think that if you just work hard enough and stay quiet enough, they will eventually see your value and invite you to sit at the head of the table. I need you to stop auditioning for people who have already cast you as the understudy. I wrote 3 rules on a piece of thick cardstock. I taped them to my new stainless steel refrigerator right next to the weekly grocery list. I read them every morning while my coffee brews. 1. Never mistake a lack of cruelty for love. Just because they are not yelling at you does not mean they respect you. A quiet insult does just as much damage as a loud one. 2. You do not have to scream to be heard. You just need better leverage. Noise is what people use when they have no power. Find your leverage, secure your foundation, and let your actions do the talking. 3. A boundary is not a wall. It is a door with a lock and you hold the key. You decide who gets to walk through that door, and you decide what the toll is going to be. My name is Kimberly Morris. I used to coordinate supply chains for an hourly wage, and now I own the highway. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, I hope this story gives you the quiet strength to stop accepting their scraps. You deserve the entire meal. Thank you for listening to my story. I read every single comment, and I love seeing the strength you are finding in your own lives. And remember, the next time someone offers you a rundown house, you had better check under the floorboards.